On the west side of central Aarhus, a vast network of yellow buildings can be found. Today the buildings house a variety of companies and organizations, but originally they were part of the beating heart of Aarhus industrial might, Frichs machine factory and boiler forge. The factory inherited Frichs' name from its founder, Søren Frichs. Originally born in the countryside near Horsens, Søren showed a desire and talent to learn from an early age. This led first to Aarhus and later to Copenhagen, where he studied technical machinery. However, in 1848, Søren dropped out of school and joined the army to fight in the First Slesvig War. In the army, Søren rose through the ranks and ended his career as a lieutenant. Although Søren saw action in all 3 years of the war, he did not witness the end of the war on the battlefield. In 1850, at the Battle of Isted, he was shot in the lung and had to endure a long, hard recovery back in Denmark. By the way, I already made a short about the battle memorial for the Battle of Isted, the Isted Lion, link in the corner of the description below. After surviving both war and 1850s medical treatment, Søren went back to learning, this time more practically, by traveling around Denmark, England and Belgium and taking jobs in metal forges. This led Søren to realize how far ahead other European countries were in the field of metalworking. This led Søren to return to Aarhus in 1853, where, after borrowing money from his dad, he built a new forge in what's nowadays the center of Aarhus. In the beginning, Frichs focused on making cast parts for farming equipment, but his reputation quickly grew, and the factory soon expanded to produce parts for wind and water mills, as well as construction materials. In the 1850s, Frichs did not specialize. Instead, they built pretty much whatever the locals ordered. This is most clearly seen in 1855, where the factory tried something new and successfully built their first steam engine on behalf of a local leather manufacturer. However, things began to change in the 1860s, when the railroad arrived in Aarhus, and as Søren has predicted, it became a major transportation hub for all of Jylland. This opened up the market, and the factory began exporting its product all across Denmark. But the railway also gave Frichs other opportunities, and they began to produce tracks, switches, coal cranes, turntables and other equipment for the railway. Søren, as well as the factory, received a reputation for high quality and excellent work, both in Denmark and abroad, with one of the highlights being an industrial bronze medal at the 1878 Paris World's Fair. But later the same year, Søren sold the factory to his two nephews, Hilmar Vestersen and John Valdemar Wirt. They were both already working as engineers for Frichs, so there wasn't a huge change. Under the new leadership, the factory continued to grow. This was helped by the growing use of steam engines in Danish industry, but in the beginning of the 19th century, the city had caught up to the size of the factory that was now surrounded by the city center. To ensure the factory could continue to grow, a large plot of land on the west side of Aarhus was purchased. In 1908 the forge moved, and the rest of the factory was in place by 1912. But even as the factory was physically moved, it never lost sight of technical development. And in 1910, Frichs began to develop their first diesel engine. As first for stationary power production, but in 1918 the first ship diesel engine was developed. Now the next obvious development for a factory that made railway parts, steam and diesel engine would be trains. And so Frichs experimented and built several small test trains, but large-scale production was hampered, as the Danish State Railroad was of the opinion that German trains were better than anything that could be produced in Denmark. However, this changed during the First World War. Denmark was neutral, but trains were in hot demand by both sides, and so no one was willing to export any trains to Denmark. This led Frichs to step up, and they got an order for 20 steam freight trains in 1916. After the war, train production became more central to Frichs. A deal was struck between the Danish State Railway, Frichs, and the German company Borsig. This meant that all trains for the Danish State Railway would be built by Frichs. But to ensure top-of-the-line trains, Borsig would help with design and produce 2 trains of each type. But even as steam trains rolled out of the factory, Frichs had his eyes on the future and began to develop diesel engines specifically for trains. And in 1926, Frichs collaborated with Scandia to launch their first diesel train, the HHJ-M1. However, Frichs was not ready to settle for just the Danish market. So, in the 1930s, Frichs was busy knocking on doors around the world. After several failed attempts, Frichs finally landed an order for diesel trains to Thailand. However, the trains were heavily delayed, and if it hadn't been for the Thai Revolution, a large fine could have bankrupted the company. But even with delayed delivery, the order still showed that Frichs engines were reliable and capable in all climates. This led to licensing deals for local production of Frichs-designed diesel engines in over 8 countries, both in Europe and also as far away as New Zealand. But on April 9, 1940, things changed, as German troops invaded and occupied Denmark. Soon after the invasion, the Nazi occupiers inquired about Frichs trains and engine for German U-boats. There was little support for the Nazi cause in Frichs, but CEO Peter Due Petersen knew that nothing good would come from outright rejection. So he did the next best thing, dragging out negotiation and in general being a pain to work with. This feet dragging meant that it took almost 2 years before the deal was reached, and it was significantly smaller than was first proposed by Germany. Only 10 steam trains were ordered. However, the feet dragging was not over. In the contract, Germany accepted that the construction of trains already ordered by the Danish railway took priority. And so, as my grandfather who worked on the floor of Frichs told me, we simply began to work slower. This mentality was also strong in regards to train repairs. If the trains were German, work took longer and more spare parts were needed to repair it. However, slow work did eventually begin on the German trains, but it was not until September 1944 that the first trains were ready for testing. But the workers were not ready to let that happen. So several workers, who were also part of the Danish resistance, asked CEO Peter Due Petersen if he was okay with them blowing up the hall where the German trains were stored. He gave them full support, and 2 separate attacks were carried out before the German occupation force had enough. On September the 25th, Nazi soldiers entered the factory and stayed there until all German trains were salvaged and moved out. This resulted in the trains being pulled to Pommern to be finished. However, due to the damage, none of the train was finished before the end of the war. But they did end up seeing serviced in East Germany after the war. After the war, Frichs' hesitation to work with Germans were almost celebrated, and this kept the company out of the post-war legal fights, and Frichs continued to work on trains. And with the end of the war there were plenty of trains in need of repair, and soon trains for both Norway and the Netherlands found their way to Aarhus for repairs. And it didn't stop. At the beginning of the 1950s, Frichs was busy producing small diesel trains of their own design. This led US giant General Motors to approach Frichs about licensing rights for GM's trains and train engines for all of Europe. For some reason, Frichs turned down the offer, and NoHub in Sweden got exclusive European rights to GM's trains. This decision later came back to haunt Frichs, as the Danish State Railway chose to buy larger GE diesel trains from NoHub, leaving Frichs as a mere parts provider. And it got worse for Frichs. Bad leadership at the time led to problems with the workers, and a business strategy that didn't focus on new developments left part of the business to fall behind and fail. This is partly why Scandia, a different Danish company, was chosen to be the Danish State Railway train provider in 1977. This in turn led Frichs to declare bankruptcy in 1979. The remainder of the company were acquired by Kosan Gas Company, which attempted to transform the factory into a producer of gas storage tanks and gas engines. But the huge factory was too big for that, and so was sold off in 1986 and then transformed into a business park. Frichs still exists today, though on a significantly smaller scale. Nowadays their main focus is engine design, mainly for generators and maritime use.